Hi to the chat. Yeah, I'm gonna like move around from like docs to paper. So yeah, but I'm gonna give you guys time if you guys want to POI later on. But just say you guys are POIing me so that I can like accept later on. Yeah, before moving on, starting my speech in three, two, one. I'm going to do three things in my speech, right? Number one, I'm going to engage the closing government's case. I'm going to prove to you why this going to environmental and going out of space is something that matters and why staying on Earth is probably going to be suicide anyway on this side of the house. Two, I'm going to engage to the interest of company that opening government brought. I'm going to prove to you why they're not going to be that evil and they're going to be better. Third, I'm going to engage to their case of funding. Four, I'm going to explain to you why the extension becomes very important, how we mechanize opening opposition's case, right? Number one, let's engage to closing government, right? Because on closing government, they say that they want to be able to save the earth and whatnot, right? Notice that this is very problematic because number one, I think I agree that the fact that this is knifing, I think there's a concession that we need to live earth and whatnot, for example. But number two, just being charitable and engaging to their case, notice that closing government really has no solvency in saying why like saving earth is going to be very easy and applicable on this app too, because we notice Hagata's entire chat, I mean the government whips, he only said that you don't have the ability to go on Mars, but why would suddenly you be able to save things on earth and whatnot, for example, right? Because just to give to you a contextualization, currently we are on a point of no turning back. The current climate is rising to 2.9 degrees Celsius, for example. So I think that to an extent, if you're trying to invest and try to change the scenery, for example, to use saving the environment and you're giving that, I think that's evil because you're giving to people false hope, for example, because you're just going to make them suffer to begin with. Right? They're going to experience more wildfire and whatnot, for example. And like if and the fact that this also happens on opening government, the fact that they also want to have more like private shuttle and whatnot, for example, it means the harm exists. So the delta then becomes what can we provide to you in closing opposition, for example, to begin with, right? I'm going to engage to opening government right now, right? Because they talk about company, right? I think the weirdest thing before going on to my rebuttal is that opening government is very inconsistent, right? Because opening government says that the problem of like environment is very urgent, but then they say no, 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 it's okay. We take a long time, but as long as it's going to be probable, right? They cannot take those kinds of stance, right? Because if their biggest case, for example, is that the companies are very profit oriented, they're going to be monopoly. I don't think that that's necessarily the case, right? Because notice, for example, that these companies really do have an image that they need to keep to themselves also, for example, right? They want consumers, for example, to opt into their products, for example. And that's why if they're starting to be that evil, to be monopolizing and whatnot, for example, people are not going to enter and they're not going to like their products to begin with, for example, right? I think this also becomes like the profit incentive as to why these corporations, for example, would want to be transparent because they have to be transparent anyway, right? To the shareholders, for example, to those people who want to, to those people on the ground, for example, the results of their, like their findings, for example, all of those things are needed to publish in order for them to gain the notoriety that opening government wants to say and wants to gain on their side of the house, right? But even if not, for example, notice that people are not stupid, for example, right? I think the fact that there's a lot of criticism and status quo, for example, becomes a profit incentive as to how suddenly people are going to want to gain the, going to gain the, want to check and balance them to begin with, right? So I don't think that the case is as simple as and as cherry picking as what opening government can contextualize to you, right? Because if opening government, for example, wants to say that there's billionaire narrative, I think it strengthens our case, for example, right? Because if, for example, that they promise they're going to make it accessible, they promise that they want to make their kinds of things like able to be opt-in by people, exactly then more people will be able to criticize them if they don't do so, for example, because that's their company's image on the line and whatnot, for example. And I think that's what's going to be bad on your side of the house. Before moving on, share POI OG.
At best, you do have innovation. Why would they be accessible? Most likely, you'll have to patent your research anyway.
Yeah, I'm gonna rebut that right now, right? Because they say about it's not going to be accessible, right? Most likely it's still going to be accessible because exactly I've told to you, if they promise, for example, that they want people to, if they promise to the people that they're going to take them to Mars, they're going to give them and work that hard anyway because that's their public image. But number two, exactly because most of the time for them to gain profit, they need a huge amount of people to enter their ships, for example, right? I don't think that billionaires want to spend like 4 billion, 400 trillion and whatnot, for example. If that's the case, or you have the house, their profit margin is going to be very marginal, right? But number two, I think think it's still going to be indirect transfer of knowledge on closing a position, right? Because you'll still hire builders and contractors, for example, that's going to gain the knowledge and the blueprints that you need on your side of the house, right? So this concludes that when you're talking about the feasibility of innovation and the profit incentive of companies still do want to opt in and still do want to be populist, exactly because government, like Mutiara said, is being driven by fascist ability, for example. They care about non-material stuff like their pride as a country and whatnot, and it shifts the ability for them to do like cooperation with other countries when it's not even if it's profitable to them to begin with. I'm going to explain that later. But number two, let's talk about funding, right? Because the biggest comparative in opening government is that there's going to be money in. They say that the comparative in this debate should be money in NASA that's not invested because there are people investing to SpaceX and whatnot. I don't think this is the case, right? Because I don't get why the profit incentive of people do want to invest NASA on your side of the house, right? Because exactly people aren't attracted to that NASA stuff. They're attracted to the billionaire tycoon and their promises, for example, right? I don't think that on government, for example, you're going to be able to fiat you gain that amount of money, for example, especially since you concede, for example, that there in most cases it's going to take a long time, for example, and that you need to work on other efforts to gain those kinds of things to begin with, for example, right? I think that's why the argument about normalization of being the billionaire tycoon is going to fly anyway, for example, right? Because exactly, I don't think people are going to be that stupid and all wants to become billionaire tycoon because most likely, for example, they're just going to invest to these corporations if they don't have the money, for example, right? That's why I think when you're talking about funding, closing a position takes this to begin with because we're the one that explains as to why people do invest in SpaceX and these companies and why, for example, the benefit and the feasibility of innovation happens, right? But lastly, right, let's talk about why Muti's extension becomes important, right? I think that reason why we take this over opening a position is that we prove to you that private institutions are the only one able to create technologies. Muti brought a lot of context as to how the public has always relied on private from the start to begin with, for example, right? But I think the second and biggest reason and the tipping point where we are above opening a position is that we mechanize OO, right? Because we give a likelihood and process of innovation. For example, we told to you about how, for example, that in companies they have a profit incentive mindset to cooperate. For example, right? SpaceX, Voyager, Genila, for example, have different tipping points and comparative advantage that they can take to make sure that their products that they sell are going to be better. For example, right? We explain this, and this mechanizes opening a positions assumption that when you put funding into money for funding into these kinds of NASA, they're going to be able to create changes. For example, that's we're going to be able to create innovation. For example, but no, we analyzed why as to how the innovation could happen and how that likely could happen. Very proud to vote for closing. Thank you.